Every Wednesdays in this particular segment of the Daily Report, we bring you the latest events on the tech and trade fronts. In our very first coverage, we touch upon what local semiconductor companies are calling excessive market intervention by US authorities. For more on this, I have our Ji Abili here in the studio. Ji, welcome.
Hi, Sunny. So last week, Washington vowed to get more aggressive in learning about the supply chain of global chip makers. We'll get into the reasons why later in the program, but that request was not very well received by the South Korean semiconductor industry. The Korean government said it will relay to Washington any concerns among domestic chip makers of having to share confidential trade information with another government. At a parliamentary hearing Tuesday, Minister of Trade, Industry and Energy Moon Sung-ok said Trade Minister Yohan Koo met with his U.S. counterpart Catherine Tai of the USTR in Paris that day. The aim of the meeting was to communicate the worries by Korean companies like Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, and more. Media reports say Yo explained to Tai the information Washington requested last month is expansive and contains confidential information of trade secrets and client data. To this, Tai responded, the RFI, or the request for information, is to alleviate semiconductor shortages and will discuss Seoul's concerns with relevant agencies within the U.S. government. Also during the parliamentary hearing, Moon, who oversees the trade ministry where Yo is the head of, emphasized that the government was working to keep local chip makers up to date regarding on the matter. The 56-year-old added his ministry will work toward activating a communications channel between the two countries for close cooperation.
Right, an active communications channel, hopefully. So do tell us more about this.
So last Wednesday, Trade Minister Yohan Koo said his ministry is ready to help local chip makers to deal with this problem. During a meeting with journalists, Korea's top trade officials said, as far as we know, South Korean businesses are currently making reviews internally to decide whether to comply with the request. He did say, we believe that the request is aimed at increasing the transparency of the supply chain in the semiconductor industry. The RFI made headlines in Korea, where semiconductors take up roughly 20% of its outbound shipments. This is especially noteworthy given that so much of the country's economy is reliant on exports.
Right, and exports have been driving our rebound amid the pandemic. Now, let's rewind back to the start of this standoff between local semiconductor companies and US authorities. Gee, when did it start?
So it started about 2 weeks ago. On September 23rd, the U.S. Department of Commerce asked global chip makers, including Korean ones, to respond to this request within the next 45 days. Let's hear from U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo on the reason.
As you know, we've been working the semiconductor shortage since day one of the President's administration, and it's time to get more aggressive. The situation is not getting better. In some ways, it's getting worse.
She added such information from global chip makers will help improve trust and transparency within the supply chain. Due to semiconductor shortages, automakers and related businesses based in the U.S. had to cut production, which led to thousands of job losses. Washington is requesting global chip makers to provide information on inventories, demand, and delivery dynamic. By analyzing those information, the government plans to identify where the bottlenecks are in the supply chain and then predict challenges before they happen. Automakers like General Motors, Toyota, and Chrysler have slashed outputs and sales forecasts due to scarce chip supplies made worse by COVID-19 related production snags in Asia. The Commerce Department added, companies will be asked to share the information voluntarily.
We'll be talking to dozens of these companies and urging them to comply. Of course, if they don't comply, then we have other tools in our toolbox to require them to give us data. I hope we don't get there, but if we have to, we will.
Taiwanese chipmaker TSMC, for its part, said the company was supporting and working with stakeholders to overcome the chip shortage. In what the company dubbed unprecedented actions to address this challenge, the chipmaker has pledged to invest $100 billion in the next 3 years to expand its production capacity. That's all for me today. I'll be back next week.
All right, as always, thank you very much for that.
Thanks for having me.